Okay, this is section 2.9 in your book. It's on solving linear inequalities. Okay, so what we're going to go over first is just how to graph a solution and how to write it in interval notation. So let's look at this right here. X is less than or equal to negative 1. X is less than or equal to negative 1. Now, we're going to graph that on a number line. Numbers on a line. Okay, now you know less than negative 1. Less than on the number line would be going to the left. So you know it's to the left of negative 1. But it could also be equal to negative 1. So what we use to show that it could be equal to, if it could be equal to something, use a bracket. If it can't be equal to it, you can use a parentheses. So anytime you have these symbols, when you graph it or write an interval notation, you're going to use brackets. Anytime you have these symbols, you're always going to use parentheses. The brackets show that that number can be included as part of that answer. So if you want to graph x is less than or equal to negative 1, you put a bracket right here on negative 1. And you shade to the left. Because those are the numbers that are less than negative 1. Now you have two sides to this graph. On the left side, it keeps going and going and going in the negative direction. And it goes all the way to negative infinity. The right side is going and going and going in the right direction. It goes all the way to infinity. Now, we want to write this in interval notation. It's just kind of a shorthand way of writing what we have graphed here. Now, you started shading over here, and you read it from left to right. I always read from left to right. You started shading the graph over here at this left arrow. That left arrow represents negative infinity. So that's what you're going to write down first, negative infinity. And you always use a parentheses with your infinities. Okay? And then you kept graphing, and you graphed all the way up until you got to negative 1. And whatever you use on the negative 1 in the problem, or in the graph, that's what you use here. So you used a bracket, so you're going to use a bracket with your negative 1. So that's how you would write that in interval notation. Okay, we're going to look at another one, number 2. One over here, can't get to it. Yes, negative infinity. It's just kind of like a little sideways 8. All right, number 2, I'm going to graph x is greater than 3. Okay, I'm going to draw our little graph just like we did before. I'm going to put a few numbers on there. I know I need 3 on there. I'll put a couple more numbers. It doesn't matter really how many numbers you show. So just show a little bit of your graph, your number line. Now, greater than 3, you know, greater than 3 would be to the right of 3. And since you don't have the equal to under the greater than sign, it's just greater than. See, it's not greater than or equal to. It can't be equal to 3. It has to be greater than 3. So you're going to put a parentheses right here on 3, and you're going to shade to the right. And see, all those numbers that you shaded are greater than 3. And that parentheses shows that you get just as close to 3 as you can without it being equal to 3. Like, for example, the number 3.000001 is included there. That's why you have to use a parentheses. It goes just as close to 3 as you can get without being equal to 3. Okay, now we're going to write this one in interval notation. Now, you read the graph from left to right when you do this. Now, on this graph, I started shading right here at 3. And I have a parentheses for that 3, so I'm going to do parentheses 3. And then I kept shading all the way to that right arrow. And that right arrow represents infinity. So in interval notation, this is called interval notation. In interval notation, it is just 3 to infinity. Okay? Now we're going to actually solve some. So let's do x minus 2 is greater than or equal to negative 7. X minus 2 is greater than or equal to negative 7. Now, you're going to solve this just like you did an equation. There is one thing you have to remember, but I'll tell you that on the next problem. So on this one, you got to get x by itself, so you add 2 to each side. So you get x is greater than or equal to negative 5. And then we want to graph that. So I know I need 5 on my graph, and I'll put a couple more numbers on there. And it says x is greater than or equal to negative 5. So, oh, it's negative 5. I did positive numbers. Negative 5. This will be negative 6. That'll be negative 4. Okay. So it's greater than or equal to. So you're going to use a bracket, and you're going to shade to the right. Use a bracket because it could be equal to negative 5 because that equal to is in there. And then greater than negative 5 would be to the right of it. So negative 5 to infinity would be the answer in interval notation, because on that graph you started shading at negative 5 and you shaded all the way to that right arrow, which is infinity. That's your answer, yes. Yeah, I think it's going to ask for both ways. It's going to ask you to pick out the graph on MyLabs Plus, and then it's going to ask you to graph it in write it in interval notation. It's going to have 2 parts to every question. I don't think it ever asks for the inequality, though. I don't think. I think it just wants it in graph. You want you to graph it and put it in interval notation. All right, number 4. Negative 8x is less than or equal to 16. Now, the one thing that you have to remember when you're solving inequalities is that when you divide each side by a negative, you have to flip that inequality symbol around. So if it's a less than, you're going to have to make it a greater than. Or if it's less than or equal to, you have to make it greater than or equal to. If it's greater than, you have to make it a less than. And that's whenever you divide by a negative. Anytime you divide each side by a negative, that's when you flip it around. If you divide by a positive, you don't change it. Only when you divide by a negative. Okay? So remember that. When you divide by a negative, you flip the less than or greater than symbol around. Okay. So on this one, you know to solve that, you have to divide each side by negative 8. So I'm going to have to flip that symbol around. So it's going to be x is greater than or equal to negative 2. So now we'll graph that. So here's negative 2, here's negative 3, negative 1. Now, since it's greater than, you know you're going to shade to the right. So you're going to put a bracket on negative 2 that opens to the right, and you're going to shade to the right. So that's the graph of that answer. And then negative 2 to infinity, like that, with a bracket on negative 2 and a parentheses on the infinity with a comma between them. That is the answer in interval notation. All right, number 5. 2x is less than negative 4. 2x is less than negative 4. Okay, on this one you'll divide each side by 2. Now you won't flip the less than sign around because you're dividing by positive 2, aren't you? It's only when you divide by a negative that you flip it around, so you're going to leave it less than. So it's x is less than negative 2. Okay, so we need to find negative 2 on our number line. Put a couple more numbers on there. Write them the right way here. So since it's less than negative 2, you're going to put a parentheses on negative 2, and then you're going to shade to the right. I mean to the left. I'm saying everything backwards. Put parentheses on negative 2 and shade to the left. So in interval notation, we started shading this graph from left to right, we started at this left arrow. So it's going to be negative infinity up to negative 2. And use a parentheses with both of those. So that's your answer in interval notation. Negative infinity to negative 2. Okay. Let's look at this one next. Negative 2. Yes. Because from left to right on that graph, looking at it from left to right, where did you start shading it at? You started shading at that arrow, didn't you? If you look at it from left to right, where does the shading start from left to right? Not from right to left, from left to right, like you're reading, you know. So from left to right, you know, if you're looking at the graph from left to right, you started on that very left side of it shading, didn't you? And you shaded all the way up to the negative 2. You've got to read the graph from left to right. So negative 2 times x minus 4 minus 3x is less than negative and then 4x plus 1, in parentheses, plus 2x. And we're going to work it out just like you do an equation. Y'all know how to do this. And you remember those steps we went over last time. You know you'll do your distributive property first. So multiply negative 2 times x, and that's negative 2x. Multiply negative 2 times negative 4, and that's plus 8. Bring down your minus 3x. Bring down your less than sign. Now, you know when you have a negative in front of a parentheses, it's like having a negative 1 that you're multiplying by everything there. So negative 1 times 4x would be negative 4x. And negative 1 times 1 would be minus 1. And bring down your plus 2x. Now we have to simplify each side of the equation. That's your next step. So on the left-hand side, you can put that negative 2x and that negative 3x together, which would give you negative 5x plus 8 is less than. On the other side, you can put the negative 4x and the 2x together, which would give you negative 2x minus 1. Now you add 2x to each side because now you have to get all the x's on one side. So that would give you negative 3x plus 8 is less than negative 1. Then you would subtract 8 on each side. And you get negative 3x is less than negative 9. And then you divide on each side by negative 3. And since you're dividing by a negative, you do have to flip your less than sign around to make it a greater than sign. So it's x is greater than negative 9 divided by negative 3 is 3. Okay, so now we'll graph that. So I know I need 3 on my number line. I need a couple more numbers. Okay, greater than 3 would be to the right. And since it doesn't have the equal to, I'm going to use a parentheses there. So you put a parentheses and you shade to the right. Now, if we look at that graph from left to right, we started shading at 3. So that's what's going to come first. So put your parentheses in your 3, and then we kept shading all the way to infinity. So 3 to infinity would be your answer. Okay, next, compound inequalities. Sometimes you have a problem that has more than one inequality symbol. So for example, if you had 0 is less than or equal to y is less than 2. Now, when you have a compound inequality, you want that y, and y is our variable in this case, so you want that y in the middle by itself. So this one's already solved. You see how you have the y and it's in the middle all by itself? There's nothing in there with it. Okay? So now the way that you graph this, so we know we need a 0, and we know we need all the way up to 2 on our number line. Now, if you look at that, if you read the left side of it, 0 is less than or equal to y. 0 is less than or equal to y. So if 0 is less than or equal to y, doesn't that mean that y is greater than or equal to 0? If 0 is less than or equal to y, y has to be greater than or equal to 0, correct? Okay, and it also says that y is less than 2. So if y is greater than 0 or equal to it, and less than 2, it means that y is going to be between those two numbers, right? It's got to be greater than 0, and it's got to be less than 2. So it's going to be between 0 and 2. And 0 can be included there because it's got the equal to on that side. So the way that you would graph this type, you're going to put a bracket on 0, and you're going to put a parentheses on 2, and you're going to shade in between. See, any of those numbers that are in between there, or including 0, would make that inequality true if you plugged them back in. See, 1 would be between 0 and 2. Also, any of those other decimal or fraction numbers that are represented on the number line between 0 and 1 and between 1 and 2, all of those would make that true. So now we'll write this one in interval notation. We didn't start shading until we got to 0. Okay, so that's what's going to come first. And we shaded all the way till we got to 2, and then we stopped shading. So it would be 0, 2, with a bracket on 0 and a parentheses on 2. That's your answer in interval notation. All right, negative 6 is less than 3 times x minus 2 is less than or equal to 8. So this is another one. It's not already solved for us, though. We're going to have to solve this one first, and then we're going to graph it and put it in interval notation. And it's the same as solving an equation. The only difference here is instead of just having 2 parts that you have to do stuff to, you have 3 parts here. All right, but your first step is the distributive property. You have to distribute that 3 first. So you have negative 6 is less than 3x minus 6 is less than or equal to 8. Now see, we have all this stuff right here in the middle. We want x by itself in the middle. Now, just like when you're solving an equation, you would get rid of that minus 6 first. Same thing here. You're going to get rid of that minus 6 that's in the middle. So that means you're going to add 6. Now, if you add 6 there, you have to add 6 to the other parts of the inequality also. You can't just do it to one part. So we're going to have to add 6 over here and add 6 over here. All right, the 6's cancel out in the middle. Okay, and they do kind of cancel out here, but you got to have something on the left side of that less than sign. So we're going to put a 0 because negative 6 plus 6 is 0. So 0 is less than 3x is less than or equal to 14. And then we're going to divide everything by 3. So the 3's cancel in the middle. 0 divided by 3 is 0. Is less than x is less than or equal to 14 thirds. Okay. So now we're going to graph that. We would know we need 0 on there. Now 14 thirds, it may be easier if you change that to a mixed number to see where it's going to go on the number line. Let's see, 3 will go into 14 4 times, which is 12, with 2 left over. So it's equal to 4 2/3. So we're going to be between 4 and 5 on your number line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's going to be about right here. That's 14 thirds. So you're going to put a bracket on 14 thirds, and you're going to put a parentheses on 0. And you're going to shade everything that's in between. Because x is between those two numbers. It's greater than 0, and it's less than, or it could be equal to 14 thirds. So the way that you write that in interval notation is 0 with a parentheses, comma, 14 thirds with a bracket.